The first signs of both food and root withdrawal occurred during the night. Shaking, the aching of his stomach and sleeplessness accompanied him together with the slight change of temperature, which was enough to give him goosebumps. Dew couldn't see the moon through the thick layer of clouds which drenched everything in black. In general, he couldn't see a thing. It felt like hours had passed, though they might have only been several minutes, that he forced himself to get out of his curled-up position, out of which he hadn't changed for an eternity. He almost crawled along the floor, his palms searching the ground for a leg of the table. When he did feel the soft warm, Duke got up and reached for the food, which was still in the same spot as before next to another bowl for dinner. He found his way to the shaft, leaned against it and felt the warmth coursing through his body while he carefully ate. It wasn't much, but soon he felt his insides calming down. He was fine. Avery wasn't. The hybrid was probably either being kept awake by whatever they wanted from him, or he might have passed out due to total exhaustion. The thought kept Dew awake when he went back to his bed with the cape in his hand to use as a blanket. He didn't want to come into contact with the mattress, ever. Even if it meant freezing during the nights, it couldn't be much worse than being alone in his own room with no extra warmth. He could tell it was early in the morning by the face of the 2 guards who stormed in while he was still sleeping. One of them, who might have taken a night shift, had dark rings under his eyes and couldn't suppress his constantly yawning, while the other, who must have just gotten out of bed, barely managed to stand steadily. Dew didn't recognize their faces, but they were in no way threatening nor sympathetic. The night shift guard simply waved at Dew, but the prisoner didn't understand, so the other guy explained, "You need to come with us. The king wants to talk to you." "Tell him I don't want to. I barely slept," he growled as if he could impress anyone. The first guard shrugged, dragged himself towards Dew and simply grabbed him by the shirt to force him out of bed. Soon he found himself with his hands stuck together by a metal enclosure and being forced to walk at the quick pace of the men beside him. He knew the area they took him to. Albus' room wasn't far away. Even more familiar did the place feel to him as he saw the door they led him to. Heavy, dark. The feeling was the same as he had had less than 5 years ago, his first time walking through a building this large and grand. It was fear and intimidation accompanied by interest, but the fear he had once had turned into disgust. The newly woken guard knocked at the door before carefully opening it. Immediately after stepping inside, he bowed respectfully while announcing, "Your Majesty, we have brought the hostage." There was no reply, but the man waved the other one to come in. Dew was pushed inside. The chamber looked just the same as last time, with the broad desk parallel to the left wall, with a comfortable chair behind it, so that the person sitting on it could easily see newcomers. There were 2 more chairs, with much less detail and exquisite handwork placed before it, but an arm's length apart. The table was packed with books, tools for writing and signing, maps and piles upon piles of paper. The shelves, which were scattered all over the room, which wasn't much larger than that of Dew, didn't look any different. The main light source were the tall windows, 3 in total, squeezed side by side with red curtains for each of them. A few burning candlesticks were lighting and warming up everything else. The screeching of the legs of one of the chairs dragging across the ground interrupted the tired silence. Soon Dew was tied to both the chair and the ring peeking out of the wall opposite to the desk. His mouth was left without a gag. The guards, having finished their work, positioned themselves on either side of the chair and vaguely looked in the direction of the king, whose chair rather appeared like a tiny throne from Dew's angle. On it a figure cloaked in shadows was bent over one of the countless papers, a feather in the hand and a pair of glasses pressed into its face. The king looked exactly like he was, a frail, weak and miserable old man who had been dressed up in expensive robes which had him appear like a donkey painted white in the middle of a horde of horses. Rufus II, the bastard king, the disgrace of his family and a barely tolerated leader, looked up from his work to face his subjects. "If the young man is tied up neatly, you will have to wait outside." His quiet voice traveled to the ears of the 3 people. The gods bowed once again and left you alone with the one out of the two creatures he wanted dead the most. And he couldn't do anything. Again, he didn't have a knife to hold to his own throat to keep the other one from hurting him. He didn't have a sword to kill with. All he had was his tongue, and that wasn't all that good when used to form words. "You killed my advisor," the king's mumbling sounded moments after the door was closed shut. "Yes," Du replied. He stared at the royal's hands, who were drying the feather and putting it to the side. After having done so, Rufus adjusted himself to look straight forward. "You took a knight's misery cord and stuck it into his neck, leaving him to bleed out." "I did." This time Du almost felt proud of what he had done. It wasn't as satisfactory to him as he had hoped for, but recalling that he had actually managed to go through with his plan gave his ego a little push upwards. The king folded his hands, asking with serious interest, "Why?" The prisoner cocked his head. "Out of the same reason I'd like you to be dead as well, actually." "Which is?" Du felt the king's eyes on him and boldly returned the gaze. "For inflicting unnecessary punishment on me and forcing yourself into my partner," he stated as precisely as he could. "Ah, I remember," Rufus thought out loud. "You were that boy who was meant for the gibbet. I must ask, now that there is no chance for you to be killed, was it you?" "No, but I wish it was," a snarling reply immediately came. "Now you mentioned you killed Sir Puff because he forced himself onto your wife. You should well know that he has no permission to do so, right?" The king kept on asking without paying much attention to Du's comments. "Then why did he do it just yesterday?" It took him most of his self-control not to burst out into screams. He didn't want to give the man that satisfaction. I can believe you to be telling the truth. It sounds like an action he would go through with, considering his comment during dinner and his lust for women who do not immediately obey his order. I have always disliked the way he treated others, especially my daughter, so there will be no punishment for your actions. For now, at least. Telling me would have led to sufficient consequences, but it must have been your uncontrollable temperament. There was a boiling deep down in Du's stomach. Why didn't the man freak out? The one sitting before him just told him he wanted him dead for the same reason he successfully killed another man before, and still the king was acting as if there was nothing dangerous or unsettling about the whole situation. And there the man was sitting, his fingers crossed and old face tired but calm and unbothered. "I have one more question before moving on to what I called you up here for," Rufus went on. "You said you despise me for the same reasons as you did with my advisor. I can understand why you feel angry with my judgment concerning your execution, but your second point, it makes it sound as if the girl was forced into it." Du spat on the ground. "Makes it sound as if? What else do you think you did to her, giving her a great offer?" The king sighed, but without a sign of guilt. It was the noise of someone who disliked having to explain someone something obvious again and again. In the whirling, the demand to strangle him with the rope around Du's body arose. I admit, at first she didn't have much of a choice, but it wasn't like she couldn't leave. It would have just cost her the rest of her information about the location of the town. She only asked once. It was the second time I called her, I believe. After 2 years, I told her my suspicion of her infertility and gave her a choice. She could be nothing more than a knight under my command, or she could continue listening to my call. It would have had no effect on anything. She chose the latter option. I didn't force her, and I believe it was this spring she came to me shortly after freeing you and told me she found someone she wanted to commit to. I didn't force her to stay. She always had a choice after those 2 years. "No," Du exclaimed, his voice drenched with insecurity and the shaking, the heavy pumping of his heart caused. "No, she did it because she felt obligated to you. She didn't have a choice." I have always been transparent with her, and vice versa. You must feel upset that your wife isn't a virgin and possible mother, but don't blame that frustration on her, because it doesn't define her worth. And don't blame it on me. I gave her a choice. The king spoke clear and confidently. Dew wanted to vomit. He already felt the sour taste in his mouth and the way his throat threatened to fill up while his head was spinning. A choice. If it had been a choice, why did she agree? She couldn't have agreed out of free will. Why else was she the way she was? No, Dew repeated once again. Swallowing hard, he attempted to keep himself from throwing up on his own clothes. He wanted to say something, but he didn't know what. Enough about the past. I want to know things I don't know about her, the king mumbled, turning his face downwards and adjusting a new piece of paper before him and dipping the feather into a small pot of ink. Maybe start with the most recent event. She admitted to having created that wind current which destroyed an entire city after being attacked and severely injured. Did she ever mention this ability of hers to you? So that's why you're doing this. You want to use her as a weapon. The hostage coughed. She's a knight, of course she is. Now do us all a favor and talk. I don't have the whole day. You don't have the strength to stay here as well, and the guards would prefer to sleep instead of tightening your airways. The cold reply irritated you. The old man had suddenly gone from being talkative to someone who demanded something. I didn't know she could do that. Immediately the king noted, but you didn't seem surprised at the revelation. What other abilities does she have? His eyes accidentally widened while he bit down on his lower lip. Damn you, he thought about himself. The tip of the feather was still hovering over the ink pot, waiting to have a word to write down. Talk, and it will be a pleasant time for you. A servant reported you didn't eat well. If you talk, you will get something you might like. I don't know of anything otherworldly she could do, Dew hesitantly replied. He felt his fingertip, his arm with the burn mark, and his back. He was aware of his skin and ears and the gills, as well as his large pupils and irises. The pink flickering inside the dark room before Avery would appear vividly played before his inner eye. And then there was the memory of a tiny pink flame in his palm, which he always carried with him in the dark. What a nuisance. I hope you would be cooperative, the king sighed before turning towards the door to shout a command. The torches flickered on all four walls. There was no window, and not even the door had a gap between frame and heavy iron. The bricks everything consisted of were smooth and tightly sealed together with thick layers of mortar. Dew barely had enough space to potentially lie down without bending his spine, and the ceiling was less than an arm's reach away. Dew didn't know how long they wanted to keep him in the, apart from the torches, empty room, but he knew after having spent only a few seconds in it that he could not do so for long. He hated how tiny everything was. Even sitting down perfectly in the middle reminded him just how little room he had. Staying on the same spot until being freed didn't seem like much of a challenge to do. All it was annoying. This perspective changed after the smoke of the torches became thicker to a point where not even being in the lower half of the room made it easy to breathe. He felt how his breathing became deeper without gaining more oxygen, and the way the smoke ached in his throat and lungs. Dew stood up and went towards the torch closest to, trying to find a way to extinguish it, but they were sunken into the wall with a grit before it, too tiny to force his hand or even a finger through. He went back to sitting on the ground, breathing the toxic air and coughing from time to time whenever he could no longer suppress it. It appeared strange to him why he was still in the room. Perhaps an hour had passed already and nobody had come in to question or cause harm to him. The walls seemed so close to each other. He sat in between them. Would they crush him? Could it be that the room itself was supposed to get him to obey? He lay down flat. No, the space hadn't shrunken. Staying on the floor, he eyed the ceiling. In the middle was a trapdoor. Just like the door, it was made out of iron. Dew twitched as he coughed again, but this time he couldn't suppress it from going on. His throat tightened while his chest shook. He grabbed his shirt and neck and he laid there, choking as if a rope was closing around his head, trying to burst his skull and squish his brain. The smoke began to burn in his eyes. He watched the flames dance and flicker whenever he failed to keep his eyes shut, and it got darker and he suspected he was passing out, but it was strange when it got even darker while his eyes were open and staring at the burning on the wall before him. But the burning had gone down drastically, only a tiny flame was left. His breath had turned into flat panting. There was just nothing to breathe. He couldn't breathe, and neither did the torches, and soon all of them would go out. The smoke was thick. The air was gone and Dew's mind was leaving. His hands let go of everything and weakly sunk to the ground. His eyes closed shut. The stench of smoke was still in his nose as he began to regain consciousness, but at least it was paired with the smell of food. His eyes fluttered open to the sight of a wide red cloth above him, drenched in the warm light of the setting sun. When he turned to his side, he noticed a new set of sheets on the bed, one without blood, and a blanket was placed on top of him. On the table he could see a new bowl of his usual food. Apart from that, nothing had changed. It took him a while to get himself to sit up. It was as if his head had the weight of a wine barrel, which he naturally couldn't lift by himself. In the end, Dew still stumbled over to the chair to then slowly fill his low needs for energy. As he sat there, he noticed he wore different clothes than before. The ones which had been stained with smoke were gone. What really unsettled him was that when he touched his hair, it was slightly wet. Immediately after the discovery, he searched his fingers. A new bandage on his wound. The rings were still there. For Bota's sake, they hadn't taken the rings. He closed his left hand around his right and held it to his chest, sighing in relief. It was as if the day simply repeated itself. He woke up again after another hour of sleep to 2 guards entering his room, but the faces were new ones. He was being guided towards the king's office and tied to a chair. This time he started to talk. "You locked me in a chamber to suffocate." "Yes," the king answered without looking up. "Was that your attempt to get me to talk?" "It was." The roles were reversed, but Dew wouldn't talk. And the king waited and waited, silently doing his work while Dew sat across from him and staring down mindlessly. After the man grew tired of waiting, he called his guards, and they locked him in the same room with new burning torches again. And again the air was slowly turned into ash and Dew's mind into mush. He found himself laying in his bed, but this time it was too cloudy for the sun to shine. He still ate, opened his diary after checking on the belongings on his person, and went to sleep. It was all he did the 2 following days as well. On his 5th day he decided to get a little more active when he noticed he had recovered from the lack of oxygen earlier than usual. Not even new food had been placed on the table. He went all around the room, looking for messages after he had coincidentally seen the other side of the table and found the sentence, "Fuck the ground and its weak-ass pawns" engraved into the wood. Dew was successful, finding other such engravings on the bed, chair, window frame, and bathtub. It was eerie to do, and even though he knew the person having written those messages had already passed away over 30 years ago, it unsettled him to know that her spirit might still be around, raging until revenge had been done. The words he assumed to be the oldest mostly said things like "die in a fire" or "drink it yourself," while the younger messages got more and more specific, saying "suffocate in the loop of the umbilical cord" or "your child will tear out your throat if I don't." The next day he was almost surprised when he woke up, not to strangers entering his imprisonment, but simply by having slept enough for him to be well rested. He rubbed the sleep out of his eyes and went towards the window. His stomach rumbled, but after having only gotten a single meal every day, he didn't assume there to arrive anything to satisfy his hunger before noon. Just a few minutes after having drawn that conclusion, it was dispersed by the clicking from the first door and the opening of the second one shortly afterwards. A woman dressed in casual robes of the lower-class servant, such as he used to be before his glorious promotion to royal trusted dirt-eater, came in with food and water which would barely be enough for a normal person to be satisfied for half a day. The woman, who appeared to be in her 30s, wordlessly went towards the table, put down everything she carried after Dew stepped aside, and turned around on the spot to leave. His eyes followed her. What did she think of all of this? Most likely she didn't know who he was and why he was here, and maybe it was better that way. If he was claimed to be dead, he was supposed to stay dead, or else the worry about him would only increase, which he knew from first experience. He would have loved to hear at least a word about his partner's well-being. Where was he? What was he doing? How was he doing? But Dew never explicitly asked. The king had started ignoring every word of his mouth, which was of no use to him. Dew never wanted to give in, no matter how much they smoked him out. The wind must have taken much energy out of him already. It would be even worse if they suddenly figured out that the night could be used to heal others, or even change them into a different kind of hybrid. The Merling was contemplating if the king had already made up suspicions about his shift of appearance as someone who had already seen a Merling's body parts in person, but Rufus had never mentioned it. Hopefully his sight had deteriorated too much to notice. He watched as the light ball behind the grey wall of cloud slowly travelled over the sky. Sadly, the houses of the city could barely be seen from his position, and the view on the garden didn't spark as much joy as it could have if it was either spring or summer, or if everything was covered with a layer of snow instead of mud. The endless blooming of the flowers disturbed him. They were the reminder of a powerful, powerless goddess. At some point during midday, after his next meal had arrived, the sun was over the roof. All Dew could see began to bore him to death. His books had been taken to his room as well, so he began to read. He already knew all the stories, but it was better than staring at the ceiling or at the threatening messengers, which were a constant reminder of where he was. But even during these activities his eyes began to tire out. The words became nothing more than black strokes on yellowish paper with no meaning behind them. Over and over he had to read a sentence before it arrived in his head. He had to put the book away before letting his head collapse on his crossed arms. The next sensation he consciously received was that of being grabbed by the shoulders and pulled up. He almost slumped into the sturdy ground. The chair fell over behind him. His heavy eyes searched for who had woken him, but the grip already revealed it to be a guard. With his own dry throat, Dew wasn't able to ask even the most basic questions, such as why they were here and why they could never just wake him up before trying to drag him anywhere. It was dark outside already, but the corridor was lit up sufficiently as he crossed his usual route of the past 6 days. This time the door to the office was already open, but one of the guards still had the courtesy to knock and bow before entering, and having Dew go through the same procedure of being tied under the chair, which must have stayed in the same position during all this time. His wrists had already gone sore, and a crust had formed on the wounds, which were triggered again day by day. The only thing which had changed was the absence of the king. The guard had bowed before thin air. The 2 men in armor split up, the person with the keys standing outside and the other without next to Dew. It took Rufus a few minutes to arrive, but it didn't appear he tried to hurry. Upon entering, he commanded the second one to stay inside the room as well, which had Dew wonder as for why. He didn't have to guess for long, because the king spoke as soon as he had seated his miserable physique and crossed his fingers. Yesterday there had been no report from General Aaron. If nothing arrived within this day, we will have to assume there to be a problem. It could be that your wife is causing it by either rebelling or dying. Either way, you will lose your head. Do you have anything to say? Dew stared at the man, not understanding what he wanted from him. Answer His Majesty the King, you prick! The guard on his right had taken a swing at Dew's face. The hostage choked and spat, its entire left half burning from the impact. He could clearly taste the iron in his mouth as he swallowed. The king's voice muttered angrily, "Get out." The guard's mouth opened while he frowned, but then he decided not to spit a slur and instead bow while saying, "I apologize, Your Majesty, it will not happen again." Then there were only 3 people left in the room. Dew attempted to rub his cheek against his shoulder, but it did nothing but intensify the pain and dry the little teardrops having escaped the corner of his eye. Young soldiers, they always take everything too tight. Where was I? Oh yes, now's your last chance to save your head in case the bird doesn't arrive. If you tell me something useful, we can simply hide you from her until we have her back under control. If she is dead already, you get to keep your life as well. The proposal was so ridiculous, Dew actually began to chuckle, earning him a confused look from the guard next to him. What is there to be laughing about? Rufus asked, as if he had just made a good offer. Dew sighed amusedly. You just told me I could keep my life while you either continue what you are doing right now or live alone. Those are the same options I had before you took me hostage, and honestly, I'd rather die. He chuckled bitterly. I wouldn't mind dying like this, it looks fast enough. Dew leaned his head to the right, his eyes half open and mouth twisted into a fragile smile. He eyed the man in the chair, his thoughtful face which currently tried to make sense of what the mareling before him had just said. The person wanted to die, but no one ever wanted to die. Living was supposed to be the biggest treasure to have on earth, and this creature wanted to throw it away just like that. And Dew knew the king had seen this happen twice before, with his beloved Adelina, who had succumbed to grief and sorrow within her new family, and with a 17-year-old girl who let herself be killed because she couldn't bear existing in his presence. And the king's face and old washed-out eyes warped while Dew was looking at him, waiting for the command to chop his exposed neck into 2 parts. And the face distorted and twisted, and Dew blinked to focus his eyes again, but it didn't work, and it wasn't the king who tore the space in between them. The man pressed himself into the back of his chair while the guard drew his weapon, pointing it towards the nauseous flickering of pink. Dew's heartbeat involuntarily quickened. He didn't want to die, not now, and the flickering expanded into a vertical crack in the air in under a second, but Dew couldn't look at it anymore because a white light stabbed him in the eyes, temporarily blinding him. As his vision returned, it was as if his airways had been soon shut. It wasn't Avery who was cowering on the ground, not what he wanted to believe to be him. He couldn't accept it to be the person he had hoped for. The mouth open and dripping with a fluid which was a mixture of red and vivid pink was heavily drawing in air, the entirety of the torso under the armor shaking while expanding and contracting with every breath. Dew saw the wings, or rather what was left of them. The one which he could see was torn in between the dark fingers of the wings. Where the leathery skin connected to the back was a large cut, which had been roughly stitched together and caused blood to flow because they had partially ripped open again. The other wing was missing entirely, not even a stump was left on the back, only a long cut where the skin was supposed to be. Almost silver hair fell over the left shoulder of the being before him. Most of the right side was gone, at the height where the neck started on the right side. The corpse moved, getting to its feet. The blue uniform was muddy, wet, and had stains of blood everywhere where it wasn't covered by iron pieces. The guard was still pointing his weapon towards the creature, but his arms were trembling and his face pale. You couldn't see the face. It immediately turned towards the man in the fancy chair and bent forward, almost losing balance, to gesture a bow. "You have returned early. Why is that?" Dew heard the king's voice. He was obviously trying to hide his fear while being face to face with a half-alive being. The knight kept the head directed towards the ground, even while speaking with a voice so brittle Dew couldn't recognize it. "It was the general. He turned against us. He wanted me to disobey." "General Aaron refused to go on with the plan, you say?" the king demanded to know, confidence flooding back into him as he recognized the girl, which he had bent to follow his will. "Yes, your majesty." The being bent over to cough wetly, having more of the liquid cover the ground underneath it. Dew watched in horror as the pink fluid stayed on top of the ground while the rest seeped in. It then dispersed into small glowing particles until vanishing from existence. He must have gone mad after the last event. What a shame. He had been such a good servant to the army. Please, the knight clenched its fist and leaned onto the table with them. Give me a second chance. I will do everything you tell me. Just let me try. The king hummed. You didn't feel the rope digging into his skin and his teeth grinding while he hoped, he almost prayed for something to happen. A sign of the creature rebelling, a plea to be left alone to find peace, but all he heard was the quiet groaning of the dying shell of a soldier. I can send you a new person to accompany you. It will be your second chance. Immediately the knight collapsed, pressing his head on the ground. Thank you so much. I won't fail this time. I will do all I can do to... I have to ask you for one more thing. The man high up on his throne interrupted the miserable creature before him. It lifted its head slightly without looking upwards. Having all of its attention, Rufus went on solemnly, but with a smug smirk of a devil on his lips. Your husband here caused quite some difficulties the day you left. The knight stood up again, hinting to look back at Duke's pale face, but never turning enough to do so. He killed my adviser. He took a sword and stabbed it into the man's neck while he was turned away. I know he had a reason for it. He informed me of the terrors the man inflicted on you, and I would have acted if given the chance. You know my stance better than anyone, but such a threatening action cannot be excused. I hope you understand. Its head nodded slowly after having processed the information. I cannot have a man this dangerous and unpredictable in my environment, even though I would rather have him walk freely. Under no circumstances I would want to have him killed, of course. So I have a request for you. Duke's eyes widened, so the king did lie, and he lied to his face. Or did he? Please relieve him of his hands for me. Only when the hybrid turned around, Duke comprehended what that command meant. His hands. Right here? The voice of someone who wanted to cry sounded. He will die. I don't have the tools. He will die. Maybe the king was glancing at the knight with false pity. Maybe he nodded. Duke's eyes widened further, threatening to burn and burst, while watching in horror as the knight took one step after the other in his direction. You aren't going to do this, right? He stuttered. Another step. Duke felt how his blood drained from his face. He felt his hands tied up behind his back with a string leading towards the ring in the wall. His left hand felt the ring on his middle finger, spinning it to keep himself from trembling. His partner stood before him and knelt down. The prisoner searched for the other one's eyes, but he couldn't find them. The gauntlets began to untie his legs from the chair. The other guard left the room upon a wave of the king who, with great interest, watched the scene playing out before him. The gauntlets loosened up and fell to the ground with a clatter. Avery moved onto his back, pushing the chair forward with ease to reach his hands. Dew felt his partner's cold hands on his wrist. You won't do this, you don't want to do this, Dew exclaimed as the rope was looped the other way until only one strand held him loosely to the chair. It was cold where his skin was newly exposed, and it was even colder where the dead hand held him mercilessly. Guiding his first arm to Dew's front, Avery began to carefully move up Dew's sleeve. Next he undid the little bandage which was still on his arms. The merling pulled back, but his partner's hand held him as unmoving as a statue. With one hand he wrapped the bandage back around, but in one place halfway in between Dew's wrist and elbow. It dug into his skin, being pulled as tight as humanly possible. Dew felt his own heartbeat, not only in his chest and ears, but in his arms as well, where the compression stopped most of his blood flow. Avery took his other arm and repeated the procedure. This time Dew attempted to push him away with the other arm, but the rope was too short to reach him, and even if, it would have been of no use. Still he shook his arm, still he tried to free himself, still he pleaded, Avery, please. This time the hybrid took a deep and shaky breath, but he didn't look up, nor did he stop. Dew's second arm was prepared. Taking both ropes in his hands, Avery knotted them together, looping them around his wrists several times over. What came next wasn't suspected by Dew. His partner knelt down on one knee before him. His hands held the one wearing both their rings, and he led it towards his own face. Dew stared down at the grey streaks of hair in between the little black left and the horns of which part had been chipped away with blades and rocks. He stared at the wounds all over his partner's face, which had stopped bleeding a while ago. Yet he still couldn't see the other one's eyes as he bent his head down, the tip of his nose and his lips gently touching Dew's fingers as he placed a kiss on them. "Please don't do this. Let's just leave. We should leave," he whispered. The knight distanced his face from him and stood up. He held the ends of the rope in his hand, which he used to force Dew to stand up and get further into the middle of the room with him. There he had the shorter one drop to his knees. A pink aura started to enclose the rope on his wrists, keeping it in place even after Dew had let go. Dew kept on staring up at the person he had chosen to be his partner for life, and the same person was unsheathing a claymore while holding him in place with the little power he had left. Dew wanted to face downwards, accept his fate of losing both his hands at once and potentially succumbing to the injuries. He wished to have a way to show some kind of dignity while he saw his vague reflection in the blade, but he couldn't. He didn't want to lose his body parts, neither did he want to bleed to death before his love. He did not want to wait for his end for so long and leave the other here. He tore at the ropes, he bit down on his lip until it bled, his heart rushing, his eyes darting around and tearing up. He couldn't escape. The knight put both his hands on the hilt of the claymore and began lifting it up. Dew barely heard his own panting and gradual sobbing as he wriggled his hands against the rope. If he had his teeth, he could have opened it, but it was out of his reach. And he cried while the weapon reached its highest point. His mind searched for words, memoirs, sounds to reach the person before him, something to make him stop, rethink the actions, and may have mercy with the sinner before him. Dew saw the entirety of the last 8 months before him. The lake, the rings, the sea, the village, the roof, the games, the training area, the half-open room, the clearing, the blood-stained sheets, the city, the kitchen, everything. And he saw as the blade came swinging down, and he screamed, "Marlene!"